The Trail of Despair. I've always had a passion for hunting, and my brother, Lucas, shared that same passion. We grew up in a small town surrounded by dense forests in the northern part of the country. We knew those woods like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. That hunting season, we decided to explore a more isolated area, a part of the forest few dared to venture into. Little did we know that we were nearing something that would forever change the way we viewed that place. It was a cold autumn, with a sky perpetually shrouded by low, dark clouds. We arrived at our campsite in the early afternoon, set up our tents, and prepared for what we thought would be a quiet hunt. The forest seemed far too silent, and although quiet usually meant good hunting conditions, this time, the silence felt wrong. There were none of the usual sounds of birds or small animals rustling through the trees, just an oppressive silence that surrounded us. On the second day, we decided to explore further. We came across a rarely used trail, and that's when we saw something that made us stop in our tracks: footprints. Huge, deeply pressed into the damp soil. Lucas and I exchanged glances, trying to figure out what could have left such marks. These weren't normal tracks. They were far too large to be from a bear and had an odd shape, almost as if they belonged to a creature from a horror movie. Without thinking too much, we decided to follow the trail, despite the growing discomfort gnawing at us. With every step we took, the silence seemed to grow heavier, until the only sound breaking the quiet of the forest was the crunch of leaves under our boots. Time seemed to slip by faster than we realized. After hours of following the tracks, we suddenly heard a noise in the distance. A dry snap, like breaking branches, followed by something I'll never forget: breathing. It wasn't the sound of any typical animal. It was deeper, more intense, almost human, yet it carried a weight that made the air around us feel thicker. We stood there for a moment, trying to process what we were hearing. "Did you hear that?" Lucas whispered. Before I could respond, the sound returned, closer this time. The snapping of branches echoed around us, followed by the low, heavy movements of something enormous pushing through the trees. I instinctively grabbed my rifle, but some part of me knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this thing was, it didn't seem bound by the natural order as we knew it. Lucas suggested we head back immediately, and I agreed without hesitation. We started making our way back, but the more we walked, the more it felt like we were getting lost. The trail we'd taken earlier seemed to change with every step, as though the forest itself was rerouting us. We tried to stay calm, but the wind carried faint, indistinct whispers, and the shadows among the trees seemed to move on their own. It wasn't long before we realized we were walking in circles. The forest grew denser, and darkness fell quickly. We knew that spending the night out here wasn't safe, but we couldn't find a way out. That's when Lucas stopped, staring up. "It's in the trees," he said, barely able to get the words out. I looked up where he pointed, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Among the highest branches, something was moving. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. It was large, misshapen, and moved in a slow, almost predatory manner. Its eyes, two glowing points of light in the darkness, watched us from above, calculating our every move. Fear overwhelmed me, and all I could do was run. Lucas ran alongside me, and we pushed through the twisted trail and the fallen branches as fast as we could. The sound of the creature behind us was deafening. Every step we took was mirrored by a snap of branches and the heavy breathing of that thing. It was as if it were hunting us, toying with our desperate attempt to escape. We ran aimlessly, trying to distance ourselves from it, until suddenly we stumbled upon a familiar trail. I recognized the path leading back to the campsite, and I'd never felt so relieved in my life. But the relief was short-lived. When we finally reached the campsite, we could still feel the creature watching us from the shadows, lingering nearby. Even though we couldn't see it clearly, we could sense its presence. Without a second thought, we grabbed our belongings in a rush and fled, leaving behind our tents and any trace that we'd ever been there. The drive home was silent. Neither of us dared speak of what we had seen. We knew no one would believe us. We knew it was something beyond comprehension. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it again. The slow, heavy breathing that haunted my dreams. I glanced toward the window, and for a fleeting moment, I swear I saw those glowing eyes in the darkness of the forest. It was still out there waiting, and somehow it knew where I was. The trail of despair. The night I became the prey. I've always been the kind of hunter who relishes solitude and silence. I love walking alone through the forest, breathing in the fresh air, feeling connected to nature. I'd hunted in that forest since I was young and knew every trail, curve, and fallen tree. To me, it was a second home, a refuge where I could disconnect from the world and immerse myself in the art of the hunt. But everything changed that October night. Autumn was at its peak. The forest floor was covered in yellow and orange leaves, creating a golden carpet under the afternoon sunlight. I set out early that day, carrying my rifle and a few supplies. The plan was simple: track a deer until dusk and return home before nightfall. I'd done it dozens of times and knew the trails and shortcuts like the back of my hand. As I walked, I noticed fresh deer tracks deeper in the forest than I usually ventured. The adrenaline and instinct of the hunt took over, and I pressed on. I lost track of time, and soon the shadows started stretching across the ground. The sky darkened quickly, and heavy clouds seemed to be racing to bring nightfall sooner than expected. It was then that things began to feel wrong. Suddenly, an eerie silence fell over the forest. This wasn't the typical quiet that comes with the end of the day. It was a dense, oppressive silence. The leaves stopped rustling, and there were no sounds of birds or insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around, trying to understand what had changed. It felt as if an invisible presence was watching me, waiting. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had only taken a few steps when I heard a snap behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows among the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the creeping sense of dread, and started walking faster. But the feeling that something was following me wouldn't go away. Every step I took seemed to be matched by another, always just outside my line of sight, hiding when I tried to look. Another snap. Closer this time. I turned sharply, holding the flashlight in one hand and my rifle in the other. The beam caught something between the trees, a human figure. At first I thought it was another hunter, but something was off. His eyes shone in the darkness, cold and fixed, like a predator's. He stood completely still, almost blending into the shadows, watching me. I tried to call out, but my voice faltered, barely forming words. Fear held me in place, and all I could do was stare, waiting for him to speak or at least move. After what felt like an eternity, he took a step toward me. That was all it took for me to stumble back, tripping over some dry leaves. When I looked up again, he was gone, vanished, as if he'd been nothing more than a shadow slipping back into the trees. I needed to get out of there, fast. I ran like never before, the sound of my steps echoing through the absolute silence of the forest. The familiar trail now felt like a maze, and every tree, every shadow, seemed to be watching me, moving in my wake. My body was exhausted, cold sweat trickling down, but I couldn't stop. The feeling that something inhuman was behind me was relentless, like a shadow that only revealed itself when I wasn't looking. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I recognized the start of the trail back. When I reached my car, still gasping for air, I took one last look at the forest. The silence lingered, and everything seemed normal, but I knew better. I knew something had been in there watching, and I didn't want to go back to find out what it was. In the following days, I shared my experience with a few hunting friends. Some laughed, saying I was making it up or letting my imagination get the best of me. Others just gave me a serious look, sharing their own stories, each different, but carrying the same sense of a dark presence in that forest. But I knew what I had seen, those cold eyes, that menacing presence, None of it could have been my imagination. Since that night, I've never returned to that forest. What once felt like a refuge is now a place of shadows and mysteries. Something lurks in there waiting, and I know better than to risk another encounter. The Forgotten Cabin. I've always been drawn to the solitude and isolation of mountains and forests. Raphael is my name, and experienced mountaineer is my title. I have always sought adventures in places few dared to tread, driven by a desire to explore the unknown. Once, I decided to venture alone into an especially remote region, a forest known for its nearly forgotten trails and the eerie aura that shrouded its autumn nights. I arrived early in the morning and, as the day wore on, ventured deeper and deeper, immersing myself in the dense vegetation. But as hours passed, I realized there was something different about this forest. The sky was overcast, and the light filtering through the trees was already sparse, casting an even gloomier tone over the landscape around me. I'd been walking for hours, enveloped in deep silence. It was as if the forest itself were suspended in some strange, unsettling slumber. And that's when for the first time I sensed it, the feeling of being watched. Night began to fall earlier than expected, and a thick autumn mist settled over the forest, transforming the scenery into a fog-laden maze. I decided it would be best to camp there, as continuing forward in the darkness would be dangerous. That's when I spotted something unusual in the distance, a wooden structure rising through the mist, hidden as though waiting to be discovered. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin, old and weather-beaten, its walls covered with moss and vines. A shiver ran down my spine as I approached, drawn by both curiosity and a strange unease. Up close, I noticed the cabin's windows were fogged, as if someone had recently breathed there in the cold of the night. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze, and I hesitated, wondering if I should go in. Logic told me it would be safer to camp outside, but curiosity and the prospect of shelter won out. I decided to investigate. The moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped by the smell of old wood and mold mixed with something else, a strange scent, like the lingering memory of a place long deserted. My eyes scanned the room, and then I saw the walls. They were covered in tiny handprints, thin and small, as if children had run their fingers over them in forgotten play. A chill shot down my spine, though I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps this had once been a shelter for a group of campers with children who decided to play here, I thought. My curiosity was cut short by a sound that froze me in place. From upstairs, slow, heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, each creak of the planks sounding like a warning. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice shaky. I waited, and for a brief moment, the silence returned. But then a low, raspy whisper answered, coming from somewhere above. "You shouldn't be here." My entire body went on high alert, and I knew I needed to get out. My heart pounded as I took a few steps back, but something made me hesitate. I wanted to see who or what had made that sound. Yet, survival instincts kicked in, and I made the choice to leave as quickly as possible. I bolted out of the cabin, but as soon as I reached the forest, I noticed something had changed. The path I had followed to get there had simply vanished. It was as if the trees had moved, blocking my way and forming a labyrinth around me. Every attempt I made to find my way back brought me face to face with the cabin again. It was as if the forest were trapping me, toying with me, forcing me back to that haunting place. Desperation began to set in, but I knew I had to stay calm if I wanted to escape safely. I looked around, trying to remember every detail that could guide me. In my mind, I repeated the path I thought I had taken, but everything seemed distorted, as though I were lost in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Then, the whispers began again, this time coming from every direction, slowly drawing closer. They were faint, distant voices, almost like an eerie and haunting lullaby. With each step I took, the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand. Then I felt something cold and invisible brush past me, as though an icy hand had touched my shoulder. I turned abruptly, but there was no one there. Yet, the sense of being watched had never been stronger. At that moment, I decided to run. I took off in a new direction, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that sinister cabin. Finally, after countless attempts and feeling completely drained, I found a clearing where the air felt lighter, signaling I was nearing the edge. The forest still loomed behind me, but I felt like I was finally breaking free. The cabin, though, lingered behind me, a shadow etched in my memory. As I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time and, through the mist, saw a figure standing in the cabin's doorway. It was tall and indistinct, with eyes glowing in the darkness, watching my retreat. One last shiver ran down my spine, and I sprinted away, never once looking back again, determined to leave that place forever. Since then, every time I close my eyes, I see the cabin and those handprints on the walls, as though they're calling me back, as though there's an unfinished story I left behind. Even far from the forest, the feeling that something is watching has never fully left me, and the oppressive silence of that night still echoes in my thoughts, a dark calling, the creature in the shadows. I've always loved the solitude of hunting, the forest, the silence, the feeling of being in tune with nature. Hunting brought me a peace that few other things could provide. I knew every trail in the forest surrounding my small town, but during that hunting season, something felt different. The forest, which had always been a peaceful refuge, now felt wrong. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but a growing sense of unease followed me each time I stepped inside. It started subtly. The wind, once refreshing, now had a chilling touch, as if the forest were warning me. Animals were unusually quiet. I noticed that the deer and rabbits, once abundant, had largely disappeared, while strange tracks began appearing along the trails. They weren't from any animal I knew. For weeks, I ignored the gnawing discomfort, but deep down I sensed something was off. One Saturday, I decided to camp by a creek deep in the forest. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to hunt at dawn. I set up my tent, built a fire, and sat by the flames, trying to stave off the growing cold. Night fell quickly, the moonless sky casting the forest in a thick, impenetrable darkness. For hours, the tranquil sound of flowing water and the crackling fire were my only companions. Then, around midnight, a strange sound echoed through the forest. It was a deep, low growl, like that of a large animal but different. It didn't sound like a bear or a wolf. It was denser, more menacing, almost human in its intensity. I froze, straining to locate its source. The darkness around me felt heavier, the silence of the forest more oppressive. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the surroundings, but the light seemed unusually weak, barely piercing the darkness. And then I saw it. Among the trees, at a considerable distance, two eyes shone through the dark, too high up to belong to any creature I knew. My heart stopped for a moment as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The glow of those eyes was intense, a pulsing red that felt almost supernatural. It was as though the shadows themselves had come alive, taking the form of a creature with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural malice. Every instinct told me to run, but I was frozen, as if something held me in place. The growl returned, louder, closer, and I realized it was moving. Its vague silhouette shuffled between the trees, with heavy, deliberate steps, almost as if it were toying with my fear, like a predator studying its helpless prey. Finally, I forced myself to move. I ran to the tent, grabbed my shotgun, trying to steady my trembling hands as I aimed. But when I pointed the gun toward the eyes, they had vanished. Silence returned, but I knew it was still out there, hidden in the shadows. I spent the rest of the night on edge, my heart racing at every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch. I was trapped in the anticipation of its next move, not knowing what to do or expect. The dawn brought some relief, but the forest still felt thick and oppressive, as if that creature was watching me even in daylight. I hurriedly packed up and trekked back to town as quickly as I could. each step feeling like a desperate escape. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Back home, I tried to put the night behind me, but I had no idea what awaited me the following night. I was drifting off to sleep when a sound jolted me awake, a low growl, eerily similar to the one I'd heard in the forest, echoing from outside. I jumped out of bed and went to the window, peering into the darkness around my property. At the edge of the forest, among the trees lining my yard, were those eyes. Red, glowing, watching. Fear gripped me again, but I couldn't just ignore what was there. I decided to confront it. I grabbed my shotgun and stepped outside, shining my flashlight across the yard. The beam flickered, casting distorted shadows all around, but the eyes stayed fixed, unmoving. I walked toward the forest, my fear building with each step, until my flashlight faltered for a brief moment. When the light returned, the eyes were gone. The following days were grim. At night, amid the silence of the house, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed around the yard, always retreating whenever I got close. Each night, the eyes would reappear, hidden among the shadows of the trees waiting. It was as if they were bound to me, to my home. Since then, the creature has become a constant presence, a shadow in my life, always there, always watching. Those red, relentless eyes continue to haunt me, following me every night. I try to ignore them to move on, but I know that as long as the echo of that deep growl lingers in my mind, I will never truly be safe. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.